The four of you have never met before, but you're in a rickety caravan. Your wrists are bound, but Adam, Jareth notices that the wrist ties are somewhat loose. The caravan wiggles and bounces on the ground, and suddenly you hear a snap, and one of the wheels pops off. The people pulling the caravan jump out and start to figure out what the problem is, but you then hear pew, pew, coming from the woods around you, and you see arrows landing into the canvas of the caravan. Soon after that, you hear screeches and chatters as four goblins rush out from the woods. I need everybody to roll initiative. Welcome to class. I'm Trevor, and I post D&D videos every week, generally on Wednesdays. In this video, I want to talk about how to run combat from the DM's point of view. This idea came from a conversation I had on Reddit with the username Mr. Rapidash. I really like helping newer players or newer DMs get into playing D&D. And other than the character creation process, I think that combat can be one of the more confusing parts of the game for newer players because it's when most of the rules kind of get involved. The Dungeon Master's Guide has rules for how to run combat, but this video won't follow the same order that's outlined in the Dungeon Master's Guide because my table doesn't really follow that order. I think the biggest thing that denotes combat is rolling initiative, and that is one of the things that separates the DM's job from the players. The DM is the one that tells the players when to roll initiative. That is when combat has officially started. After that point, it's going to run a bit differently depending on if you're playing Theater of the Mind or playing on a mat of some kind. This can be a digital environment like Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds, or it can be an actual physical mat. Heck, it could be the back of wrapping paper. It has 1-inch grids in the back of some wrapping paper. It doesn't matter what the mat looks like, but like tactical, kind of physical games will run somewhat differently than Theater of the Mind style games. But the order of the timeline, at least for my games, is pretty much the same. You roll initiative and you figure out the order of the turns based on the initiative rolls. Now, this does leave the question about surprise in the example from the beginning of this video. In my game, the goblins, after initiative is rolled, the goblins would get, maybe not all of them, but some of them would get the first attack on the players or the player's caravan because they surprised the party. And the opposite could happen. Your party could be having a conversation with someone, and the person, like the player who's having the conversation, could say, I punched them in the face. And that's theoretically an option. And if they actually mean it, you as the DM can decide if you want to have them roll initiative and then make that first attack roll and then start the actual turn order from there, or have them roll the attack roll and then roll initiative. It's pretty flexible, and it's up to you ultimately how you want that to operate. Sly Flourish is a pretty excellent example of the actual rules for surprise, and I'll link that blog post in the description of this video. Once you've determined the initiative order, then as the DM, you will make sure the flow of combat happens kind of smoothly and at the right pace. You will run all of the enemies. Now, it's up to you if you want to run the allied characters that are with the party. In my games, I let my party handle that. I use a modification of the sidekick rules if they happen to have an ally traveling with them, and I let the party control what they're doing. Sometimes that character just hides. They're not even participating in the combat at all. But I like to only focus on the enemies or the layer or the environment or whatever. There's enough already that as the DM we have to focus on. I let my party handle the other stuff. Before I get into the actual intricacies of running combat for the enemies, I want to talk about rolling initiative for the group of enemies, because there are different ways to do this. You as the DM are controlling more than one character, often. I mean, unless it's like a big bad. That means that you determine if you're going to roll all of their initiative at once or roll it completely individually, or how you're going to handle that. I think both of those are obviously extremes, and what I tend to do is I tend to group them. So I'll have like a roll for the ranged goblins and a roll for the melee goblins, and I'll kind of seed them in that way. This isn't a technical rule, and you may want to do it differently, but I like kind of grouping them off and having like 2 goblins go, and then 3 goblins go, and then 2 goblins, something like that. It tends to speed up combat for my table, and it means that it's not like one player and then me and then another player and then me twice, and then that can get very convoluted. Whereas if you group up like with like, it can speed things along a little bit. It's just a suggestion. You don't have to do it that way. Regardless, it's now combat. You've rolled initiative and you're getting into the swing of things. Enemies will work similarly to the way players work. What I mean by that is enemies will be able to move, they'll be able to act, and they'll be able to use a bonus action. Those are the three things that enemies can do in combat. And that's really what their turns will boil down to. You're just going to be in charge of more of them than your players will, because they only have to worry about one character that they're controlling. As you DM more, you'll realize when it is the appropriate time to break the rules of the game. Enemies do not need to follow the same rules that players do. You'll notice that sometimes enemies' bonus actions are better than players, or they get multi-attack sooner, or what have you. And there are times where you'll even take it a step farther than this. There are times where you'll give your enemies turns after the players, often called like legendary actions, or you'll let them cast 2 spells in a turn, or what have you. This will all come in time, but I want to make sure that you do not feel pressured into keeping things as strict. I fundamentally do not believe that it is cheating to bend the stat blocks of the enemies to make combat more enjoyable for everyone. Now, if you're bending the stat blocks so you can have more fun, that's not necessarily the point, especially if you're having fun at the expense of your players. If you're bending their stat blocks so the table can have more fun and the combat is more enjoyable, I say go for it. I mean, I homebrew stat blocks most of the time, and it's for this very reason. Quick tip before I get back into the flow of combat: when you're counting the HP for enemies, so like your goblin goes and then one of the PCs attacks that goblin back, I would suggest counting up, not down, for their HP. You know what their maximum HP is, and I would suggest counting up to it. It's easier to add than it is to subtract. I saw this tip somewhere. It might have been a Matt Colville video. It's a pretty popular online in the D&D community, and it's saved me a ton when it comes to speeding along combat encounters. So count up, not down. It's generally a quicker way to handle things. As a DM, you'll handle the stat blocks for monsters, and like I kind of mentioned earlier, you'll realize what exactly you need or what you need the most from stat blocks. There are a lot of homebrew stat blocks that look differently to the published stat blocks in the monster manual, and you'll figure out exactly what you need and what you use most of the time. The homebrew stat blocks that I come out with on this channel don't always look exactly like the ones in the monster manual, and I've talked a lot in previous videos about Matt Colville's action-oriented stat blocks, which I simply adore, and they're a different way to present monsters in combat. I think that having that kind of open-mindedness when it comes to what a stat block should look like is really beneficial as the DM. But I digress. Jumping back into combat, you play for the enemies, play progresses in initiative order, and you just keep bouncing back and forth in initiative order. It is fairly easy to track, and in this capacity, combat can actually be easier than role-playing in other encounters because there is a sense of structure inherently intertwined in combat. I know I can say, okay, Sally, you're on deck, and then Laura is going to go, and then I'm going to go, and then Kyle will go. And you can remind people, and that is especially beneficial in larger parties. When it's more freeform and you're doing the exploration style game or role-playing encounters, then it can be overwhelming because there's so much choice. It can lead to analysis paralysis. Whereas in combat, there is more of a linear progression. Now, as the DM, it's your job to make combat dynamic and interesting. So instead of just saying, all right, the goblin shoots an arrow at your character, Laura, Adam, it's your turn, what do you do? You can be more dynamic and be more descriptive in what happens and then lead from one moment to the next, right? The goblin's silver-tipped arrow whistles through the air and hits Laura's character in the shoulder. But before she winces out in pain, Adam, what does your character do, right? There's more of a flow and it's so much more fun. And if you do it, your players are also more likely to do it. Combat will continue back and forth. Now, most often, combat will continue until either your party is defeated, which hopefully doesn't happen, or the enemies have been defeated. But, and this is where I'm going to kind of end the video, I want to talk about some tips. And the first tip that I want to talk about when it comes to running combat is that combat does not need to be to the death. For some creatures, it will be. If they're fighting gnolls, for instance, gnolls are pretty bloodthirsty. That's probably going to be a situation where they fight to the death. But it's not always going to be that simple. So don't feel pressured into always making it a slugfest to the death. That's one way that combat can be bogged down. If there are two bandits or, I don't know, like pickpockets fighting your party and one of them dies, the other one is probably going to bolt. Why would they continue fighting if their partner in crime just died? It doesn't really make a lot of sense, and I would play enemies with some sense of their character, right? Whether that's intelligence or bloodthirstiness, don't feel pressured in making every combat a life or death situation. A couple more tips. You are in control of monster HP. And what I mean by this is, let's say Sally's character gets a critical hit on a goblin. She describes her barbarian slashing her axe through the goblin's clavicle, and it would leave the goblin with 2 HP. But you're the only one who knows that. As far as I'm concerned, that goblin died, because that is such a cool moment. Now, if the goblin was at full health, and these are level 1 characters, maybe that's not the case, right? Or if it's the big bad, you would know when it's the best time to bend the rules in this way, but do not feel obligated to stick to exactly what's written. It is so much more enjoyable for a player to get that experience of killing an enemy than it is to just be a stickler about, oh, well, no, they would have 1 HP left, so, and then Adam, you're going to cast Eldritch Blast? Like, that's so lame when there was this cinematic moment that just happened that could have been the killing blow. Remember that combat can also include minigames. So your players could have to stop a ritual, or they could have to rescue a hostage, and these things could all be happening between the blows of combat. That allows combat to be way more creative and way more fun, and avoids the just situation where it's like sacks of hit points slapping each other for a half an hour. And I think that is the biggest thing when it comes to making combat enjoyable, is early on, just Diablo style hack and slash combat is going to be very fun. But there will come a point where that could feel boring. And if you feel like that's happening with your party, add other things. Even if it's just natural events, there's an earthquake or there's a thunderstorm and lightning hits a tree and it crashes across the playing field. These things make combat they make it come to life. And that is where a source of a lot of this fun in role-playing is, especially because you're not bound by programming. Other than the programming of your brain, there's not a specific structured course of events that needs to take place. You can come up with something that is more dynamic and more interesting that would make the situation way more enjoyable. So keep that in mind when you're planning your combat encounters. Those are my tips for running combat from the DM perspective. I know this was kind of a loosey-goosey video, but I think that's okay. You roll initiative, you determine who's surprised, you kind of lay out what the combat area is going to look like, whether that is a physical space or a theater of the mind situation, and then play proceeds back and forth between players and DM. And it's a matter of keeping it enjoyable and engaging for everyone at the party, or at the table, pardon me. I'm going to do another video in this kind of mini series where I talk more about how combat works from the player's perspective. This one, I just wanted to focus on the DM's job because there is a little bit more responsibility placed on the DM, or at the very least, it's just a different kind of responsibility placed on the DM. So keep an eye on the channel for that player-focused combat video, and subscribe to the channel if you like D&D content of all kinds. I have tips and information for new players, as well as homebrew, sometimes inspired by Magic the Gathering, and sometimes just straight from my brain. But as I always say, be safe, make smart life choices.